Welcome back to Dave and Mackie's Shiny Side Out. This is show number 463, 363, and 400.
That's our Grand Stadium intro.
It is indeed. Now, we are going to talk about the numbers. The numbers. What numbers? Well, a lot of numbers, in fact. It's over the last few weeks, over the last few months, few years, we've been living through turbulent times. Okay? This has led to many of us taking their eyes, our collective eyes, off the ball. We've been watching the shadows on the cave wall, forgetting the issues facing us in reality. Right? We've been looking at the puppetry, the mummenschanz, the pantomime, mistaking it for what life actually is. And this show is dedicated to the reality sandwich. Please take a bite. Why? Because we can no longer blithely live into the day, thinking that, things are just going to work out. They're not. Things are not just going to work out. Okay? And Dave and I are going to go through a number of different topics here and just highlight what actually is happening in the world. Okay? I'm going to start with war. Military conflict took place during every year of the 20th century and 21st century, unfortunately. There were only short periods of time where the world was free of war. No war. The total number of deaths caused by war during the 20th century has been estimated at 187 million, but is most likely higher. Certainly, if you take the knock-on effects, such as famine and disease into account as well. The Uppsala Conflict Data Center Program, the UCDP, the leading provider of statistics on political violence, has identified 285 distinct armed conflicts since 1946. This includes all organized military conflict over government or territory involving one or more state governments, causing at least 25 battle-related fatalities in a year. Okay? Two trends over the long term are immediately detectable. First, colonial and interstate conflicts, which accounted for half of all armed conflict early in the period, have waned, so there's less of them now. Today, the predominant form of conflict is internal to a state, although quite often involving external actors. Right? You can take as an example there ISIS, which was an external actor, but certainly broke states internally. The second trend is the distinct rise in the number of civil or intra-state conflicts, peaking in 1991, followed by a decline. 1991 witnessed 52 armed conflicts, in contrast to 32 in 2003. Since 2003, the number of armed conflicts has risen and fallen, ranging between 30 and 52 per year. This pattern of rising and falling numbers is simply due to the onset of new conflicts set against the number of conflicts that end. The steep decline in conflicts from 1992 to 2003 was due to fewer conflicts starting anew than the number ending. The accumulation of conflicts over the course of the Cold War resulted from more wars starting than ending. To further reduce the number of conflicts in the world today, we must not only work to resolve the ongoing conflicts, we must also try to prevent others from starting. Conflict-related casualties do not follow the same pattern as the number of armed conflicts. The number of battle casualties apparently peaked in the early 1950s. Despite the low number of conflicts, this period contains some of the most deadly wars in the post-World War II era, notably the Chinese Civil War, 1946 to 49, the Korean War, 50 to 53, and wars such as Vietnam, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia, Eritrea account for subsequent peaks. The general pattern, though, is one of decline, which with each peak falling short of its predecessor. The small rise in battle casualties evident in recent years results primarily from the civil war in Syria, and I think now also in Yemen. Dave?
Yes? Can you hear me?
Very faintly, my friend.
Really?
Yeah, you sound a little like a little man in a tunnel.
Wow, that's really weird. Hang on. Let me adjust something.
That's better. Maybe you move closer. Hello?
Yeah, let me see. Is that working
Ah,
again?
there you are.
Yay, finally. All right. Yeah, that's weird. All right. Famine. The data includes information only up to 2016. This does not include any data on the current food emergencies affecting Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. More information on these crises can be found at fuse.net. FEWS. A famine is an acute episode of extreme hunger that results in excess mortality due to starvation or hunger-induced diseases. It is this crisis characteristic that distinguishes it from persistent malnutrition, which you might have found in Africa, for instance, which we discuss in another entry on this website, says the author. As we discuss in the data quality and definition section below, which I hope we've included, the term famine can mean different things to different people and has evolved over time. It is only in recent years that more precise, measurable definitions in terms of mortality rates, food consumption, and physical signs of malnutrition have been developed. But despite these ambiguities, it is nonetheless very clear that in recent decades, the presence of major life-taking famines has diminished significantly and abruptly as compared to earlier eras. This is not in any way to underplay the very real risk facing the roughly 80 million people currently living in a state of crisis-level food insecurity and therefore requiring urgent action. Nevertheless, the parts of the world that continue to be at risk of famine represent a much more limited geographic area than in previous eras, and those famines that have occurred recently have typically been far less deadly, as we will go on to show in this entry. For this entry, we have assembled a new global data set on famines from the 1860s until 2016. Oh, I hate when you accidentally swallow your own saliva the wrong way. We estimate that in total, 128 million people died in famines over this period.
And if you want to know more information, you go to ourworldindata.org, and they've got a whole set of data. This is on famines. The key thing we wanted to highlight here is the 128 million people that did die from 1860 to 2016. That's a real thing, and that's not including anything that happened in the last 5 years, by the way. All right?
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the famine in Yemen, not wanting to be rhyming here, but it just happens to do so, is severe. It's a severe famine, and then we had the locusts in Africa. It's just horrendous. The next component we're going to look here is slavery. Contemporary slavery, also known as modern slavery or neo-slavery, refers to institutional slavery that continues to occur in present-day society. Now, these are scary numbers. Estimates of the number of slaves today range from around 38 million to 46 million, depending on the method used to form the estimate and the definition of slavery being used. The estimated number of slaves is debated, as there is no universally agreed definition of modern slavery. Those in slavery are often difficult to identify, and adequate statistics are often not available. The International Labour Organization estimates that by their definitions, over 40 million people are in some form of slavery today. 24.9 million people are in forced labor, of whom 16 million people are exploited in the private sector, such as domestic work, construction, or agriculture. 4.8 million persons in forced sexual exploitation, and 4 million persons in forced labor imposed by state authorities. 15.4 million people are in forced marriage. A really worrying trend. It's not part of the show notes here. I watched a documentary recently, a prison survival guide. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. Says that in America, a significant number of prisons are taken over by the private sector, and essentially to have a slave labor force available. which is being exploited to the tune of 3 cents a day, if they get paid at all. And so that modern slavery, these work camps, as you will, or gulags, are now in existence in the United States.
Well, going home with your life intact, Mickey, is the bonus.
Well, I guess that's true. If you have a sentence that ends, that is right. But yeah, no, it's a real thing. Hundreds of thousands of people. Well, there are millions of people in prison. Hundreds of thousands are in these labor camps, slave labor, essentially, right? And they make all kinds of things, goods and services even that we all consume on a daily basis. Almost 3/4 of all the slaves are female, and 1 in 4, 25%, is a child. With modern-day slavery most prevalent in Africa, followed by Asia and the general Pacific area. North Korea has the world's highest rate of slavery. North Korea, with about 1 in 10 people enslaved, followed by Eritrea, 9.3%, Burundi, 4%, Central African Republic, 2.2%, Afghanistan, 2.2%, Mauritania, 2.1%, the South Sudan, 2%, Pakistan, 1.7%, Cambodia, also 1.7%, and Iran with 1.6%. India is home to the largest number of slaves globally, with 8 million. Right now, we're talking about numbers, not percentages. Followed by China, 3.86 million. Pakistan, 3.19 million. North Korea, and again, this is the percentage that we said earlier, which was, where is it? North Korea, where's the percentage? Oh yeah, here we go, 10%. 2.64 million. Nigeria, 1.39 million people. Iran, 1.29 million people. Indonesia, 1.22 million people. And the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 1 million. In Russia, 794,000. In the Philippines, 784,000. Now, the reason the percentage in India is, of course, nowhere near, let's say North Korea 10%, is because India has got 1.2, 1.3 billion people. So 8 million is a vanishingly small percentage, but in totality, that's why I wanted both numbers here. That's a high number. 8 million people enslaved in India. Almost 4 million in China. These are massive numbers. Think about that for a second, people. Human trafficking generates an estimated $150 billion each year in illicit profits for traffickers and slave masters.
Yeah.
That's nuts, Dave.
Yeah, so human traffickers trafficking all sorts of people, and some of the stats that are out that aren't in this discussion are 12 to 14-year-old girls.
Yeah. Oh, it's...
And they get stolen. It's so bad. Now, when Meki and I were talking about this, I think it was at 75 million or something like that globally, and I was telling one of my friends, and I said, "Oh, don't be stupid. That slavery is gone. No, it hasn't. You white privilege."
And that's why this is the reality sandwich, Dave. Right? That's what this is.
It's very difficult to consume information that is uncomfortable. So, learning the truth about our nation and our nations. And in Australia, we've got slaves here. They just don't meet these numbers.
Right.
That's it. We're not being, patriotic to the cause and ignoring our internal matters. So, Meki, the other one is poverty. So, the World Bank Group's goal are to end extreme poverty and promote shared prosperity. This mission underpins this is their statement, all of our analytical, operational, and convening work in more than 145 client countries. For almost 25 years, extreme poverty, the first of the world's Sustainable Development Goals, was steadily declining. Now, for the first time in a generation, the quest to end poverty has suffered its worst setback. Global extreme poverty is expected to rise in 2020 for the first time in over 20 years as the disruption of the COVID-19 pandemic compounds the forces of conflict and climate change, which were already slowing poverty reduction progress. It's exasperating it. The global extreme poverty rate fell to 9.2% in 2017 from 10.1% in 2015. That is equivalent of 689 million people living on less than $1.90 a day.
Think 689 million.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they're big numbers. And not very much money, to be honest. At higher poverty lines, 24.1% of the world lived on less than $3.20 a day.
That's a quarter of the global population.
And 43.6% on less than $5.50 a day in 2017. 43%. Mickey, that's almost half.
Almost half. 3 and a bit billion people have less than $5.50 a day to live on.
Yeah.
Take $5.50 out, multiply over the year, 365 days, right? That's less than $2,000.
Yeah, a year.
You live on $2,000 a year? Anyone? Bueller? I don't think so.
That's not even the mortgage for a month.
Nuts.
$2,000. Goodness. Wow. In 2018, 4 out of 5 people below the international poverty line lived in rural areas. Half of the poor are children. Women represent a majority of the poor in most regions and among some age groups. About 70% of the global poor aged 15 and over have no schooling or only some basic education. Almost half of the poor people in sub-Saharan Africa live in just 5 countries: Nigeria, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Madagascar. More than 40% of the global poor live in economies affected by fragility, conflict, and violence, and that number is expected to rise to 67% in the next decade. So we're 3 years in already. Those economies have just 10% of the world's population. Wow. About 132 million of the global poor live in areas with high flood risk. Now, there you go. Bangladesh, India. My goodness. They just come straight to mind, they do. But many people who had barely escaped extreme poverty could be forced back into it by the convergence of COVID-19, conflict, and climate change. A nowcast, this is a preliminary estimate, for 2020, incorporating the effects of COVID-19 pandemic, projects that an additional 88 million to 115 million people would be pushed into extreme poverty, bringing the total to between 703 and 729 million.
Yep.
So keep going, Mackie.
The new poor probably will be more urban than the chronic poor, be more engaged in informal services and manufacturing and less in agriculture, live in congested urban settings and work in the sectors most affected by lockdowns and mobility restrictions. Middle-income countries, we've already seen this now, right? I mean, people at the unemployment lines, people that had really steady service industry jobs, gone. Tourism industry jobs, gone. And that goes from transport right through to hotels and restaurants, etc., including attractions. We're talking, people that were making a good living. Right? Middle-income countries such as India and Nigeria will be significantly affected. Middle-income countries may be home to 82% of the new poor. New research estimates that climate change will drive 68 million to 132 million into poverty by 2030. Additional. Climate change. This is from climate change. Okay. Climate change is a particularly acute threat for countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. the regions where most of the global poor are concentrated. In a number of countries, a large share of the poor live in areas that are both affected by conflict and facing high exposure to floods. Countries such as Nepal, Cameroon, Liberia, and the Central African Republic. The newest and most immediate threat to poverty reduction, COVID-19, has unleashed a worldwide economic disaster whose shockwaves continue to spread. Without an adequate global response to cumulative effects of the pandemic and its economic fallout, armed conflict and climate change will exact high human and economic costs well into the future. The latest research suggests that the effects of the current crisis will almost certainly be felt in most countries through 2030. Under these conditions, the goal of bringing the global absolute poverty rate to less than 3% by 2030, which was already at risk before the crisis, is now beyond reach without a swift, significant, and substantial policy action. So, and here is where they try to shoehorn in the Great Reset, of course. Mm-hmm. Now, there's always a reason we do these things. But we also brought these numbers to you to highlight. Again, the numbers are real enough, right? With variances of errors and such, but these are real numbers. And people forget just how many people just don't live like they do. 700 million people, Dave. 700 million people. That's people that we not even talk about the working poor here, right? These are people below the poverty line, in extreme poverty. There's a huge section of society, and this is particularly relevant for the United States, where single mothers or single income families, or even if it's dual income families, working 3, 4, 5, 6 jobs just to stay afloat. Mm. These are the working poor. They'll work 18, 20 hours a day and not get ahead. They just won't get ahead. There's nothing they can do. All right? I mean, they might as well be slaves. What's the difference? All right? In fact, slaves probably work less.
Yeah.
Okay. It's if you put things into context, it is really very, 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 very strange that we have allowed this. Well, it's not strange. it's just what happens. It's not strange at all we allowed this to happen, because that's the final end result of thousands of years of careful planning. And we, in the last few hundred years and then the last few decades, we've seen an acceleration towards the final goal. The next component bit, Dave, we put in because people always talk about the cryptoids, the cryptozoologists, and always making fun of them. People, hunting for Bigfoot, or Yeti, or Alma, or the Mokele Mbembe, dinosaur-like creatures potentially, Loch Ness monster, etc., etc. All these creatures, right? Because everybody was like, look. If it was out there, we would have found it by now. Dave, we would have found it by now, okay? So let's be very clear here, okay? We recently, in living there in the last 20 years, we realized that there is such a thing as a gigantic octopus, right? It was washed up and we found it. For the first time, like a proper specimen.
Giant squid.
Giant squid, yeah. Before that, there was some anecdotal evidence, some rotten corpse. We didn't know what it was, but we have now incontrovertible evidence that they, in fact, exist. Last week, or the week before, we found a new species of whale. A new species of whale. The whales aren't small. Yeah? But no.
Yeah.
We know it all. We know it all, Dave. We know it all, but there's a new whale. And forget about the Earth for a second. We found a new gland inside our head. Not a small, it's like 2 inches across. A new gland. It's always been there.
In our own head.
How can we have found a new gland in our head? We've been chopping our heads open for thousands of years, and no one has come across this gland. But there it is. A new mucus gland. There it is. Done.
So I want to add. I just want to add to this that there in 2020, scientists have described 213 new species. 101 new ants, 22 crickets, 15 fishes, 11 geckos, 11 sea slugs, 11 flowering plants, Mickey, 8 beetles, 8 fossil never mind, 7 spiders, 5 snakes, 2 skinks, 2 aphids, 2 eels, 1 moss, 1 frog, and 1 fossil amphibian, 1 seahorse, 1 fossil scallop, and 1 sea biscuit.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
And
nuts.
we're finding new stuff all the time.
All the time.
Too. All the time. All the time. All the time. Why? Because so how much land is covered on the Earth by humans? 10%.
Yeah.
Thereabouts. 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's been a huge urbanization. So back in the olden days, we probably covered more land because a lot more people lived on the land, right? Doesn't mean they were all over the land. It just means they were in more rural areas, right? It still doesn't mean they covered all of the land, still lived in their little hamlet or village or whatever, right? But now there's been a massive centralization to urban centers all over the world. It's just what happened. Now, land cover is one key way that we can measure how much of the terrestrial environment has been covered by humans. Earth's surface is about 500 million square kilometers, thereabouts, right? But most of that, about 70%, is water, right? Which we're not really very good at. So that 70% of the Earth's surface, we don't really inhabit at all. Okay, let that sink in for a second. You know, all these USOs and, underwater bases, all these cryptoids or cryptids rather that live in the water, etc., etc. That's start to make a lot more sense. Okay, so ignoring oil rigs and the occasional cruise liner, we're only talking about a total possible land surface to cover of roughly 149 million square kilometers. Now, of course, land cover is something that is changing all the time, right? And our technology to estimate, the usage is actually improving, right? So even fairly recent estimates may already be out of date. Okay, a meta-analysis in 2011, which included 326 studies of urban land cover using remote sense technology, such as satellite images, et cetera, found that urban land cover increased by nearly 60,000 square kilometers between 1970 and 2000. 60,000 square kilometers. We're still, nowhere near it. In the year 2000, estimates suggest that globally urban land covered somewhere between 700,000 and 3.5 million square kilometers. Now, always remembering that we're talking about 149 square kilometers land surface. 149 square kilometers, right? That's so this is a tiny fraction thereof. That's a pretty big margin of error still, of course, right? The meta-analysis found that the largest rates of increase in urban land cover were seen in India, China, Africa, no surprise there, while North America experienced the largest total change since 1970. Again, no real surprise there. In all regions, urban land expanded either faster or equivalent to population growth rates, suggesting our societies are also becoming more expansive. Using data from 1970 to 2000, the researchers then tried to project future urban land cover change. Their results predict that global urban land cover will increase by a further 1.5 million square kilometers by 2030. Now, bear with me for a second, right? 149 square kilometers that we could potentially inhabit. 149 million. Mm-hmm. If we take the largest, let's say in 2000 the larger estimate was 3.5 million square kilometers, and then we take into consideration the 1.5, so it brings us to 5 million square kilometers by 2030. Okay, 5 out of 149 million square kilometers. Mm-hmm. Do we still think we inhabit this planet? Of course we do, but not all of it, not even a fraction of it. And there's still stuff to be found. If Bigfoot was really there, we would have found it by now. No, you wouldn't. Mm-hmm. It would have eaten you, maybe. I don't know, right? But the point is, you have to put the numbers in perspective. People have a real hard time, Dave, with big numbers, right? I get it. I understand it. But look at the ratios of these numbers.
Yeah, that's right.
5 million square kilometers in 2030 versus a total land surface area of 149 million. That's an extra 144 million square kilometers of land we don't really inhabit. Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry, Dave, why don't you tell us more?
Okay, so I'm guessing it's according to?
That's it.
Good. According to the FAO Global Land Cover Share Database, produced in 2014, 0.6% of Earth's land surface is defined as artificial surfaces. Artificial surfaces include any areas that have an artificial cover as a result of human activity, such as construction, that's the cities, towns and transportation, maybe extraction, this is open mines and quarries, or waste disposal. The figure gives us an estimate of roughly 900,000 square kilometres of human covered land worldwide. This suggests the lower end of the estimates made in 2000, or the year 2000, were probably more accurate, and that we've still got a long way to go before we hit the CETO and colleagues' predictions. However, even non-urban areas contain roads, train tracks, farms, and other marks of human domination. The FAO GLC share data shows that 12.6% of land is categorized as cropland. If we include this to our estimate of global human cover, we get a rather more sobering estimate of 19 million square kilometres. In 2009, the European Commission Joint Research Centre published a map in the World Bank's World Development Report showing that 95% of the world's population is concentrated in just 10% of the land surface. However, only 10% of land on Earth was considered remote, more than 48 hours from a large city. So on one hand, you could say from these results that 10% of the Earth is inhabited by humans, or you could take a more glass half empty view and say that 90% of the Earth is covered by humans, either populated or connected with an ever-expanding network of roads, train tracks, highways, farms and industrial land. Only 10% of the world is truly wilderness.
Yeah, so which is in fact then still more land than is urbanized, right? So if you look at percentages and real numbers, because that's about 15 million square kilometers that I consider true wilderness, or like completely untouched. But I think it's much larger because, yes, the railway lines and transportation goes through Siberia. Let's take Siberia as an example. It's the single largest uninhabited area of the world is northern Siberia. There's nothing else that would rival its status. And you do have trains and roads running through it, but no one goes beyond those, or the cities or towns that line those transportation highways and arteries, right? The rest of it is still completely unexplored wilderness. We have here the list of uninhabited regions. Now, of course, the list changes every year. It can never be complete or considered complete. As a group, the list of uninhabited places are called the non-ecumene. The non-ecumene. This is also a special geography term, which means the essentially uninhabited areas of the world. And what we have here is virtually all of Antarctica, the Antipodes Islands, all of the Atlantic Ocean, the Ashmore and Cartier Islands, a whole bunch of islands, of course, right? Much of the interior of Brazil, Dave. That's interesting, right?
Yeah.
And what I found really interesting is much of eastern Oregon. I did not know that. Much of Fiordland, New Zealand, much of inland Greenland, right? All of the Gulf of Aden, okay? A whole bunch of islands again, much of Iceland, right? Then we get a whole bunch of other ones, Jarvis Island, and a whole bunch of other islands.
Especially its highlands. It's quite rocky terrain.
Oh, it is.
And it's there's a lot of lava outcrops, or volcanic regions there. So
yeah, much of far north Canada, much of northern British Columbia, much of northern Ontario as well. Okay, the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia, of course, the Orkney Islands, virtually all of the South China Sea, much of northern Siberia, as I just outlined. Himalayas, much of the Himalayas, especially Tibet's alpine zone and naval zones, and again a vast number of islands as well, completely uninhabited. Okay. nobody there. But which brings us to food surplus, Dave, because we spoke about hunger, right, or starvation.
Mm-hmm.
What about food surplus?
Yeah, like millions hungry despite world food surpluses. Now, this came from CNBC, and I think the author is Mark Kober, and it's from the Global Post, 2013, July 22nd. Of the roughly 7 billion people in the world, an estimated 870 million suffer each day from hunger. That's hunger from malnutrition or not eating even the lowest amount of daily recommended calories, which is 1800, by the way, while often enduring food insecurity or not knowing where the next meal is coming from. I like how there's an or. It should have basically said the same. It's the same thing. Food insecurity, whether you don't know if you're going to have money to buy any or there's going to be any. The consistently massive population of hungry people, along with variables like severe weather and economic downturns, sometimes spark warnings that the planet faces impending food shortages. And yet, more people in the world, 1.7 billion, are considered obese or overweight from daily caloric intake that in some cases is at least 6 to 7 times the minimum. This paradox is nothing new, experts say. It just shows that the problem isn't that we have too little food, it's what we do with the food we have. More than enough food? Good question. We have 2 or 3 times the amount of food right now that is needed to feed the number of people in the world, said Joshua Moldavan, a geography professor at Sarah Lawrence College who focuses on food and agricultural instruction. A lot of people aren't analysing the situation correctly. We can deal with short-term food shortages after a disaster, but fixing long-term hunger gets ignored, he said. We don't have food shortage problem, said Emily Pine, a professor of international politics and economy at the University of Puget Sound. What we have is a distribution problem and an income problem. Pine said, people aren't getting the food. Even if they did, they don't have enough money to buy it. If there is enough food, a major problem causing scarcity is what we do with it, says Roger Johnson, president of the National Farmers Union, an advocacy group for US farmers. Something in the area of up to half of all that's produced is wasted, said
That's
Johnson.
incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Who runs his own farm in North Dakota. In the undeveloped world, the waste happens before the food gets to the people, from lack of roads and proper storage facilities, and the food rots, Johnson said. In the developed world, it's the staggering amount of food that's thrown out after it gets to our plates. Of the near billion who go hungry, some 852 million live in developing countries, according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the WFO. But the world's largest economy and the richest country on earth is not immune from hunger. An estimated 1 in 6 people, or some 50 million US citizens, are unable to afford to buy sufficient food to stay healthy. According to the Department of Agriculture, nearly 17 million are children. Our services are needed now more than ever, says Ross Fraser, a spokesman for Feeding America, a non-profit hunger relief organisation. With so many people out of work, it's hard not to figure out why. Yeah, that's right. It's not hard to figure out why. My mistake. Many low-income seniors use us on a regular basis. We serve some 3 million a year, Fraser said. They have fixed incomes, and with other costs they have, like medical bills or just paying the rent, possibly even power, utilities, they're often in need of food assistance. Seniors or other anyone else trying to get a handle on food costs are constantly riding a seesaw of inflation. In 2012, according to the WFO, global food prices rose to near record levels, rising 6% last July alone. But according to the Global Food Security Index, food and beverage prices worldwide should drop by 5.7% through 2013, mainly due to bumper crops of corn and wheat resulting in favourable weather conditions. Food inflation and scarcity go hand in hand, said Mary Lawton Johnson, a food specialist, chef and author based in Palm Beach, Florida. I'll read this quote and then it's off to you. Given a natural disaster, food and other items naturally go up in price, she said. Once that scarcity is gone, food inflation reduces.
Correct. Now, before I go on, this was written in 2013, July, this article, right? And so obviously 8 years have passed since, and we are now living in the COVID world, where all of this is much, much worse. So this was then. You can imagine how much worse it's gotten today. Plenty of solutions is the questions. It is ironic that good or healthier food, like apples, are more expensive than food laced with sugars or fats, said Payne. We need to be more thoughtful on what we grow. But the reason for the higher prices is fairly simple, said the National Farmers Union's Johnson. Crops like vegetables and fruits are more perishable, so they are more expensive to grow, he said. Unlike other commodities, they're just less profitable for farmers. A further irony in the world's hunger problem is that farmers outside of developed countries make up the majority of the world's poorest and hungriest people. Many farmers don't make enough to live on each year, Ron Johnson said. Underdeveloped economies and some global trade are pushing them to the side, marginalizing them. The WFO cites various causes for hunger and food insecurity: poverty, war, climate change, shrinking land and water resources, economic and political disruption. Suggested solutions are just as plentiful. We don't need more corn and soybeans, which have become part of the ethanol focus to be energy efficient and for feeding livestock, Payne said. What we do need is to produce food to eat rather than industrial commodities. Technology could be a key to ending food scarcity, said Charlie Arnold, CEO of the Center for Food Integrity, a non-profit group with business members including ConAgra and DuPont. We should be using more genetically modified crops that would produce stronger and sturdier crops, Arnold said. I disagree. That's what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. We need to move food from where it is to where it isn't, and that means investing in agriculture development using the best technologies we have. I don't disagree with that, but I'm not a big GMO fan. But technology comes with risk, said Chef Mary Lawton Johnson. I am not in favor of genetically modified foods to feed a starving world, she said. The health side effects can be dangerous, in my opinion. I like her. What we need is more localization of food growing. We talked about this just earlier. Let the crops natural to the land grow instead of pushing crops that are not meant to be there, she said. I completely agree. And be more seasonal. That's what I'm saying. Food shortage solutions includes taming the investing markets, said Sarah Lawrence's Moldavan. The market trading of commodities is overbought and not helping food prices, said Moldavan. Why does a bushel of wheat have to be traded 5 times a day? I think we need to step out of the way of the marketplace and let it take its course, said Tim Richards, a professor of agribusiness at Arizona State University. We're destroying local food markets around the world by forcing them to buy U.S. commodities. We should stop global government support for farmers. The market does a fantastic job of sorting out prices in food production, said Richards. If we just stay out of the way, food shortages could be eliminated. I disagree. It is very, very dangerous to leave the market to regulate itself. I think that's it really is a recipe for disaster. Last October, the WF issued a warning saying a global food crisis could happen in 2013, and I think we're seeing it, and we're seeing it today, and every day it's happening. The alarm was over rising food prices, lack of grain reserves, and extreme weather conditions. All those conditions have receded this year as prices have pulled back. Reserves have increased, and some areas of the globe have seen better weather. But eradicating world hunger won't be as simple as drought-ending rains or silos full of wheat, said Moldavan. A lot of folks have different opinions on how to solve the problem of hunger, he said. But we have to reframe the debate from food shortages to understanding why so many people are not accessing good, nutritious food. And this is really the crux of the problem. Why do we have over 1 billion people that are obese, while we have almost 1 billion people that will probably die of starvation?
Mm-hmm.
It is because of this failed economic system that we have. Look, Dave, at the end of the day, it all stems back from a fundamental issue. We have allowed the parasites to rule. We've allowed parasites to come forth and issue currency. And it is the new god. Currency is the new god. It is. I'm not being, silly. Our new god is currency and what it allows us to do. And the more we have, the better. If you don't have it, well, forget about it. You have no chance whatsoever. You will starve to death in the most extreme circumstance. And that is really fundamentally the issue. All of this is related. Everything that we've just discussed with you out there, these are not isolated issues. These are not issues and challenges that have nothing to do with each other. They're all intimately connected. We have an overriding problem here. We have to change the way we live significantly, or there won't be anyone left. Maybe a couple of really fat people sitting in front of computer screens, lobotomized. That'll be it. But Dave, I think we've got a bit of time to go into the question of the world surplus of food.
That's good. So the world has a surplus of food, so why can't we eliminate hunger? Correct?
That's the one, my friend.
Excellent. All right. Published in April 15th, 2017. This article was published then ago. Some information in it may no longer be current. Never has there been so much food in the world. Farmers have grown far more in that year than all 7 billion of us could possibly consume. So mountains of surplus foodstuffs are piling up in dozens of countries, including Canada, and the price of that food is falling fast. Yet, there is hunger. Not in many years have so many been at risk of starvation. For the first time since 2011, the United Nations is using the word famine to describe the looming situation in half a dozen countries. On Tuesday, relevant to April 15, 2017, the UN warned that 1 million people in the Horn of Africa, Yemen and parts of Nigeria are on the brink of famine, and 20 million live in areas where harvests have failed and malnutrition is on the rise. How can both these things be true? Somehow. The Reuters Newswire service carried these two headlines on Tuesday, within hours of each other. Grains piled on runways, parking lots, fields amid global glut, and risk of mass starvation rising rapidly in Africa and Yemen. Starvation does not happen because of a shortage of food, and starvation does not happen because there are too many people. There is plenty enough food for all the world's people. In fact, with little effort, we could double the amount produced. Governments are paying farmers to cut back their harvest as we have run out of storage space. Nor does starvation happen in 2017 because food is too expensive. That was the case 10 years ago when soaring commodity prices sent food costs rising after 4 decades of declining to the lowest share of household budgets in history. In response to those high prices, investment flooded into agriculture and land under cultivation expanded greatly. Now those lands have produced an almost unprecedented 3-year sequence of strong harvests, and the world is awash in food. One consequence is that food prices have finally started falling back to historic lows. In March, prior to the April that this was written in 2017, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization announced that global food prices is falling 2.8% in a month. Vegetable oils by 6.2%, milk by 2.3%, and the only product experiencing a price rise was meat. The world currently has a third more rice and wheat in storage than it is expected to consume, or sell, or turn into fuel in 2017. The combined world surplus of wheat, corn, rice, and soya recently surpassed 670 million tons, or enough food, or feed, to feed all of China for a year. Why didn't someone just ship some of that surplus food to Yemen, maybe Somalia, Nigeria, or South Sudan? That, after all, is what usually happens when drought or emergencies cause crops to fail. Sri Lanka, for example, is also experiencing a drought this year, its worst water shortage in 4 decades, one that has wiped out the entire year's rice crop. Yet nobody in rice-dependent Sri Lanka is starving. The government simply spent $350 million to import enough rice to make up for the losses. This hurt the Sri Lankan currency, but the economy has kept growing and people are eating. To add to that, people aren't dying. This is what happens when drought strikes countries that are in peace. They import more food. None of the African and Middle Eastern countries facing famine this year are at peace, and in many cases the famine has nothing to do with drought or crop failure. In northeastern Nigeria, the war with Boko Haram has prevented farmers from cultivating crops. If the fighting causes them to miss the May-June planting season, 7 million will be at risk of starvation. In Somalia, the Al-Shabaab militant group continues to block food aid and the organizations that deliver it, and disrupts or sells food shipments for its own needs. In South Sudan, the government and security forces have blocked humanitarian aid, putting its horrendous civil war ahead of the lives of people. In 2017, only war and extremism prevented people from eating. It should be a priority for every developed country government to break the barriers and give these people a share of global food hoard to get through crisis, or to this crisis, that crisis. They then need to develop the capacity to connect their countries back to agricultural markets. Most of the famine victims are the children of farmers. Their death would be the world's most preventable and heartbreaking catastrophe.
It is one of the reasons, certainly, why people don't eat. Another reason, of course, is that you can't just give food away. If you give food away, you depress the price. So people in Europe, in the United States, would rather destroy food.
Where's the profit in giving it away?
No profit. And then, the funny thing is this, especially the United States, under the guise or the guide of Monsanto, wants to give away, millions of tons of GMO food. But in this case, African nations, or others as well, have said, no, thank you very much. Mm-hmm. I don't want your GMO food, and fair enough too, because the seeds themselves are completely useless, because you can't. They won't germinate the second generation, so they will sprout and
they're not heirloom seeds. That's right.
No, they're not. And then the second generation of seeds are completely useless. I mean, it's just fodder or feed or food. Right?
Yeah.
You can't crop save. You can't seed save, which is what farmers do traditionally. And there's the music. So look, I'm sure Gerber is coming up with something after this. As always, it's going to be an awesome roundtable he's having. Dave, any last thoughts for our esteemed listeners?
Oh, completely. This is David Meckie's Shiny Side Out. This was episode 463. Subscribe or follow us on any social media platform that you can find us on. Listen to Revolution Radio and enjoy the show that we see in the world media. It's a Dog and Pony show. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for listening.